Hi and welcome to the 7th video of the online orientation for SDE Teachers for 2017-2018 school year. This video is about cultural challenges. Let's have a look at what we're going to discuss here. First of all, we're going to look at some artwork to consider differences between cultures, particularly looking at East and West. Then we'll consider some of the major terms that we talk about when we talk about cultural challenges you might have, so culture shock and fatigue. Look at some terminology around the building blocks of culture and use this terminology to make comparisons between the East and the West that can then help us to understand some of the problems we'll face in China and help us to tackle some of those problems in a few examples of things that you might experience when working in China. I'm going to show you a series of slides. I'll encourage you to pause the video so that you can look at the slide for a little while, as long as you like, and then write down what you think is being represented before I then continue and reveal what the artist intended this to mean. I think you'll get the idea pretty quickly. So here's the first slide. If you want to pause, then please pause now. Okay, I'm going to reveal the title. This slide is referring to opinion. One obvious interpretation would be over here, someone is expressing their opinion very directly, and here someone is taking quite a long time and going all the way around the houses to get their point of view across. This is something that is often expressed about some people in China, that they don't feel comfortable expressing their opinion very directly, and they would rather find a softer, more circuitous way to get their point of view across. Here's the next slide. If you want to pause it, then do so now. I'm going to reveal the title, Way of Life. So this is focusing, based on my understanding, on the idea of an individualistic way of life where one person is the sole center and the most important unit in one's life, or a collectivist approach where the smallest unit in your life might be your family. So you put your family ahead of all personal interests and focus on doing everything you can for your family. Or for some other larger group, it might be, a group of friends or a school or even your country that you would put ahead of yourself. This is the third slide. If you're going to pause, then do so now. I'm going to reveal the title. This is At a Party. So here people are freely moving around, talking in small groups. It's chaotic, it's disorganized. Whereas over here, everybody is perhaps sitting in a circle, or they're sitting around a large table, or they're all focused on one central point. In China, if you go to a banquet, then everything will be focused around one senior guest or leader, and they will often lead the conversation and lead a toast. I think you will see this particular difference quite often in China, especially with school events and the like. Here's the fourth slide. If you're going to pause, then do so now. I will reveal the title, Handling Problems, or Dealing with Problems. This person is plowing through the problem, whereas this person is finding their way around it. It's somewhat similar to the expression of opinion. It seems to suggest a culture that is quite happy to confront things head on, find a way through, solve the problem, move on. But, this could equally be a solution to a problem here. This could be a creative solution, a different way of thinking or a different way of approaching things. Perhaps both of these solutions are equally valid, and that's something that's interesting about living in China. It can teach you different ways of doing things that you had perhaps considered before. This is our fifth slide. If you're going to pause, then do so now. Otherwise, I will reveal the title, Queuing. Over here we have a very regimented queue. Everybody is waiting in turn. Right here, people are forcing their way in, whatever way they can get in. Perhaps obvious what the comparisons being made here is. Number 6, if you're going to pause, then do so now. Otherwise, I'll reveal the title. The boss. To me, this is talking about the concept of power distance, which is the idea of if someone is your boss, how far away are they from you in terms of power distance? So how easy is it for you to influence them, to communicate with them, and to bring about change in their decisions? In the West, we would expect to be able to talk to our boss fairly easily, and there wouldn't be too many barriers to that. Whereas in China, you might expect that a boss is just not very available to you, and your potential to influence them and perhaps to talk back or to change their mind about something would be very limited. Okay, so this is the last slide in the set for the first activity, thinking about cultural differences. The blue is intended to be a particular culture. It's actually based on German culture, and the red is based on Chinese culture. It's an artist who lived in Germany for a significant period of time and then created these pieces of artwork to demonstrate her understanding of the differences between German culture and Chinese culture. I think if you've put some time into thinking about those slides, you should be able to start anticipating the kinds of problems that you might have when you come to China. So in this next section, we'll look at culture shock and fatigue. So culture shock sounds like a pretty self-explanatory term, but what we mean by culture shock is the temporary stresses, temporary issues that you have to deal with when you are adjusting to a foreign environment, particularly to a foreign culture, as China may very well be for you. Culture fatigue, on the other hand, is really a long-lasting build-up of these stresses wearing you down over time and really causing you to lose your patience with a culture. It's worth making a distinction, because culture shock, it's not all bad. It's actually, some of it can be enjoyable, interesting, challenging, whereas fatigue, it's really just about the negative effects. In effect, if the negative aspects of culture shock go on for too long, that's when you find yourself in a situation of culture fatigue. So, for example, everyone looks different. Yeah, you've just come to China, and hey, everybody dresses differently, they all look different. But it might be exciting as well as challenging or slightly upsetting, so you may have mixed emotions about that. Fatigue is really when you start saying things like, I've been here for months, I still can't get over the fact that people push onto the metro even before I can get off. So not really being able to adapt and accept aspects of the culture. Moving on. Let's look in more detail at the process of culture shock. It starts with what's referred to as the honeymoon phase. That's really a period where you're excited, intrigued, you're curious. You're looking around and you're going, wow, look at this wonderful new place. It's so interesting. It's so different. All I want to do is just go outside and explore and meet new people and try all the food and see all the new places. And it's certainly something I've enjoyed about living in China and moving from one part of China to another. But it is inevitable that this will wear you down a little bit. It can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. And then it can turn into what is called negotiation. And this is where you're struggling to come to terms with what happens in the new culture. So you're confused about certain things that people do, certain ways that people act, behave towards you and towards other people, and you become irritated and annoyed by this. And because people behave in a way that is so alien to you and you simply can't understand, you feel a sense of isolation, because as a human being you are used to fitting in. Well, most of us are, at least. We are used to understanding our place in the world. We're used to understanding how we fit into a culture, and when we go to a new culture and we don't fit in, there is a sense of isolation. And for a lot of people, that's something that may have not happened to them before. They may have not felt that way ever, or maybe for a long time, since school, for example. And to have that happen again when they're an adult can really be quite a shock. And it's really worth pointing it out in this training before you come to China, so that you know that that's probably going to happen, and that you shouldn't be ashamed or upset with yourself if it does. And you should be ready to accept it and find ways to deal with it, and that's what we'll go on to discuss in a minute. Adjustment. I think it's kind of self-explanatory, but it's really about getting over those problems, those confusions, the things that are really winding you up and making life difficult. Finding a way to understand why people behave the way that they do, accepting the fact that things are just different here, seeing things as normal, just, explaining it to yourself, accepting it, moving on. And to be honest, that could take you a few months to get there, but it could take you all year. Hopefully, if you talk to friends, talk to people like me, talk to other teachers about these sorts of issues, you can reach this in within half a year or so. You really feel quite comfortable here, and then you'll get more out of your experience. Then adaptation. So this is really where you start to master being in the culture. You adapt yourself and adopt some of the culture yourself and really start to become more like a local in certain ways. It doesn't mean that you will totally change and lose all aspects of the culture that you originate from. You're always going to have certain opinions and certain attitudes and certain behaviors that you can't let go of. So the next thing is not always considered an aspect of cultural shock, but it is something that's worth pointing out, and it could affect a lot of foreign teachers. So it's the re-entry. This is talking about when you return back to your own country. So if you've been in China for a significant period of time and then you head home, you might find it's quite shocking to go back to your own culture. You've become so adjusted, or even you've adapted to living in China, getting along with Chinese people, getting along in a Chinese workplace, that when you go home, you see the culture from a totally new point of view. You see your own culture in a different light, and that can be quite shocking. You can almost go through a whole new phase of culture shock as a result of that. We've still got culture fatigue up at the top there, and it's worth pointing out that this is where culture fatigue is going to occur. During this negotiation period, you're trying to get from that initial joy of the honeymoon through to this period here where you're adjusting, and through negotiation and into adjustment, that's where your culture fatigue is going to happen. So it's when you are pushing through and coming to terms with the differences and accepting things and learning to live with what's different here that you're going to get really worn down. And it was really interesting working as a manager last year to see how many people really hit a brick wall around 3 months into their experience, and people would start complaining and losing their cool to some extent because they just had enough of these challenges, of enough of dealing with the culture and adapting to the culture, and they just wanted to complain about things that been suppressing and putting up with for so long. So be wary of that. If you're feeling like that, it's perfectly understandable, and I'm expecting it to happen, and I'll be encouraging other people at SDE to expect that and be ready to support you and talk to you about it. And ultimately, a lot of the time, what you need is someone who's just going to listen to you complain for a little bit and say, hey, you know what, I understand, I know why this is happening. You may think you're being unreasonable, but it's perfectly understandable. So just accept that culture shock is a normal part of coming to China, and be ready for it, and don't be too hard on yourself. Yeah, what are the things that contribute to this? So it's the negotiation and the adjustment phases. You're struggling every day to change the way that you see the world, to change the way that you understand what people are doing. You may not be consciously aware of it, but it's going on. Every time you're faced with a frustrating communication with someone, or a frustrating reaction from someone that just doesn't make sense to you, that puts a strain on you. You don't like it. It's not something you're used to. You're used to people understanding you, and you're used to understanding other people. Feelings of loss and deprivation. So you've left behind good friendships, perhaps a job, family members, sports teams that you played with, things that you enjoyed doing in your home country. You weren't able to bring all of those things with you, and you might not realize until you get to China just how much those things mattered to you, and just how much those things gave you a sense of self and a sense of self-confidence. And it's not that easy to click your fingers and replace those things straight away, and that will put a strain on you, and that will certainly contribute to that period of negotiation and adjustment. Also, as mentioned on the previous slide, you may feel that not just people, but the culture itself is rejecting you, because the culture doesn't seem to understand you, doesn't seem to see where you're coming from. That it can't understand your way of behaving. It almost can't accept it. So you may feel that way, and that can make you feel very isolated. Again, you may not feel that you fit in, you may not understand where your place is in the culture, so what is expected of you? What do people want you to do in a given situation? How do people expect you to behave? You behave the way that you always have, you behave naturally, and you get a confused response, you get a confused reaction. That can be really challenging, especially when it's happening every day. So be aware that this is something that is going to happen naturally, not necessarily something you can plan and prepare for. It may just happen to you. And another possibility is that you simply find certain things in China to be shocking or alarming or just unacceptable. So mentioned smoking before, could be spitting, it could be personal hygiene, it could be proximity on the subway or on the pavement. You might find that people don't give you quite as much space when you're moving around in China. And that wears you down, tests your patience. It could be the fact that people stare at you all of the time because you're different. So all of these things can contribute. And then feeling that you just don't know how to deal with this. You don't know how to get over these problems. You don't see yourself changing. Perhaps you don't want to change. And then that just piles more strain on top of all of these other problems. Okay, I've made the situation sound pretty bad so far. So let's move on and see what we can do about it. So let's consider each one of these things in turn. Our strain from psychological adaptation. Well, I mean, this is a possible solution to pretty much all of these problems. Share your experiences. So find a way to put it down in writing or to talk to a friend, some way in which you can form some sort of soundboard for your experiences so that you can then contemplate them, get some perspective on them, and then understand where you're coming from, but also through doing that, start to understand why that's happening. Make some time to stay in touch with home. I think most people would do this naturally, but it's really important to, regularly get in touch with family and friends because they'll remind you who you are and they'll accept you and you can share your experiences with them. It's always good to talk to people that really understand you deeply and can just give you that little ego boost or that feeling of home that just makes you feel normal again. Make foreign friends and make local friends. So both of these can have positive effect. Foreign friends might understand exactly the problems that you're having. They might have different perspectives. Again, you can share your experiences, learn from each other. Local friends are going to be able to explain what's going on to you. They're going to be able to make things a bit clearer, a bit easier to understand. And also they'll help you with any feelings of rejection or isolation because you'll feel, oh, I've got local friends. Well, people here do like me. They do accept me. I do fit in. You're confused about what's expected, you're confused about what people value. So learn about the culture, try and understand why China has different expectations, why different things are valued here versus what you would expect to be valued from your own culture. Shock, anxiety, and disgust. If you find that you're someone who is complaining a lot about hygiene, or the standards, or the traffic, or smoking, or spitting, then okay, you might be a bit frustrated with the experience you're having in China. If you find that you're sitting down with other groups of foreigners and complaining about all the things that are wrong in China, then you might be entering into what I would refer to as China bashing. And this can happen with groups of expats in lots of different cultures, where people come to the culture and they don't feel that they fit in and they feel there are lots of things that are wrong with it, and they sit down together and they kind of get into a little echo chamber where one person expresses an opinion and their friends that they're sitting around with express the same opinions back to them, and they just confirm everything that the other person is saying until everybody just says, oh, well, we're all right because we're all saying the same thing. I really want to encourage everybody to avoid that and to always try to be open-minded and try to understand why you might be frustrated with something that's going on. Some things are just not nice and, Chinese people won't accept them and foreign people won't accept them. Spitting isn't particularly pleasant and it's not particularly hygienic. I'm not suggesting that we should just accept it. But I can also at the same time understand where something like that comes from and why a lot of people here spit and why a lot of younger people don't like it and don't spit so much. So I can have that understanding, and once I know that a lot of Chinese people don't like it, then, oh, okay, it's not a Chinese people do it and foreign people don't do it thing. It's some Chinese people do it and some Chinese people don't. Finally, you're feeling helpless? Well, ask for help. There are experienced teachers who've lived in China for a long time, people like myself, who will be able to understand where you're coming from. We're not going to think that you're being unreasonable or whinging or whining or anything. We're just going to want to listen and try and help you out. So people like your academic consultants and myself, we're here to help with those sorts of problems.